In today's video, we're testing 35 macOS games on the new M2 Mac Mini. Pause the video now for the specs of my machine. Our first game to look at is the survival horror shooter Resident Evil Village by Capcom and the Apple Metal Engineering team. At 1080p max graphics, it performs quite well, which surprised me, with about 40 to 50 FPS. If you want 60 FPS at max quality, this is where the game's Metal Effects settings come into play. Metal Effects upscales a relatively low resolution image to a higher output resolution. I'm playing it with quality enabled. While it's mostly 60 FPS now, it will drop a tiny bit during some challenging scenes, but overall it's much better performance now. You can also play at 1440p 30 FPS with prioritized graphics enabled. This is only possible thanks to Metal Effects being switched to quality once again. This type of performance on Mac Mini would have never been possible on the previous Intel Mac Mini with integrated chips. Hopefully ray tracing can be brought to this game with the M3 chips in the future. Mega City is an interactive tech demo set in a futuristic city landscape, alive with flying vehicles, scores of highly detailed game objects, and unique audio sources. It all showcases what's possible with ECS for Unity. ECS being Entity Component System, which is a data-orientated framework compatible with game objects, enabling developers to build more ambitious games. On this M2 Mac Mini, Mega City runs at 1080p high with 21 to 30 FPS. I find this kind of impressive as this tech demo has not been optimized for Apple Silicon Macs in any way. I simply downloaded the Intel x86-64 build for Windows from GitHub and converted it to an ARM64 application with Metal 2.2 support for Mac under Unity 2022.2. I've built this demo to demonstrate to developers not only the power of Unity on Apple Silicon based Macs, but how well a game can run on pure M2 even without any major optimizations. Up next is Disney Dreamlight Valley, the new life sim by Gameloft. Disney Dreamlight Valley runs very well here on the M2 Mac Mini. I'm playing at 1152p resolution, near 2K, and high graphics. As you can see, it's a mostly locked 60 FPS in this state, sometimes dropping down to 58 FPS. Be sure to turn on VSync with this one to remove the noticeable screen tearing and to avoid the annoying performance dips during challenging scenes. Previously, Baldur's Gate 3 ran at 1080p Ultra with 30 FPS on pure M1 and M2 based Macs. Now it runs at 1080p Medium with 30 FPS. This is because Larian Studios updated the game's engine with new tech, which is considerably more demanding now. Thankfully, Elvarel's added AMD FSR 1.0 support to the Mac port last year. Similar to Metal Effects, AMD FSR is used to upsample an input image into a higher resolution. If I put AMD FSR to Ultra in Baldur's Gate 3, this will allow me to run the game at 1080p Ultra with 30 FPS once again. Just make sure to enable VSync and enable a 30 FPS cap for the best performance. It's also worth noting, Baldur's Gate 3 requires 10GB of memory on Apple Silicon based Macs. It's currently not officially supported on M1 or M2 based Macs with only 8GB of memory, so keep that in mind. Elvarel's told me they are looking into adding Metal Effects support to the Mac version of this game, but can't guarantee it. Moving on to Metro Exodus, the story-driven FPS shooter. At 1080p high, we're seeing about 40 to 60 FPS, which I think is pretty impressive for a game of this caliber. At 1080p medium, it's quite a bit better at 60 to 80 FPS. 1440p high receives around 30 FPS. In my opinion, Metro Exodus is quite enjoyable in this state. Visually it looks stunning, and 30 FPS is okay due to the game's slower gameplay. 4A Games and Apple collaborated on this Mac port, and it runs on Molten VK and Rosetta 2, the Intel emulator. Despite this, it has great performance. It would be interesting to see if they could add HDR and ray tracing to the Mac port one day, and I also wonder if it would see any improvement if it wasn't running through layers of emulation. Warhammer 3 is likely the most demanding game to try on any Apple Silicon based Mac. So how does it fare on M2 Mac Mini? Well, at 1080p medium, it sees 34.4 FPS in battle and 27.3 FPS in campaign. Not anything to write home about, but again, this type of performance would never have been possible on a Mac with an Intel integrated graphics card. If you want to play at 1080p high, it's possible thanks to Feral Interactive adding AMD FSR 1.0 support to this game. With AMD FSR enabled and screen scaling set to 72%, we're seeing 30 FPS in battle and 28 FPS in campaign. What about if you want 60 FPS? To achieve this, play at medium settings with AMD FSR enabled and a screen scaling of 62%. This will provide 61.0 FPS in battle and 52.1 FPS in campaign, which is pretty awesome. The game runs via Rosetta 2 due to some of its middleware not supporting Apple Silicon. That said, the game was optimized for Apple Silicon, so while it's not Apple Silicon native, the rendering and shaders use methods and optimizations specific to M1 and M2. While Shadow of the Tomb Raider was supported on the 2018 Intel Mac Mini, it ran at 720p lowest settings for about 30 FPS on average. Now on the 2023 Mac Mini, it runs comfortably at 1080p high with 35 FPS. This is also the best state to play the game on M2 Mac Mini, even the M1 Mac Mini. Its stunning graphics are on display, and the lower frame rate is playable for this game. At 1080p medium, it only jumps up to 37 FPS. It's not really worth it. If you want near 60 FPS, you'll need to play at 900p medium settings with motion blur off and pure hair set to low for 54 FPS on average. If you're lucky enough to have an external display with HDR, this game supports HDR and is one of the best Mac games to experience this tech with. We might not have Microsoft Flight Simulator on Mac, but we have the next best thing, X-Plane 12. At 1080p medium settings, it's hitting around 30 FPS. On first impressions, you might not be impressed, but consider how much this game must render in the world around you. You can also play at high settings, thanks to the dev adding AMD FSR to the Mac port. With it set to balanced at 1080p high, we're still seeing 30 FPS. Similar to Baldur's Gate 3, just note X-Plane 12 is only officially supported on M1 and M2 based Macs with 16GB of memory. It's a huge game. Psychonauts 2 is a pretty demanding indie Unreal Engine 4 game to try on Mac. So how well does it play on M2 Mac Mini? Well, here I am playing the game at 1440p medium settings with 40 plus FPS. Not bad in my opinion. The strange thing with this one is that I saw the same performance at 1080p medium and 900p medium. I could not get it to receive a locked 60 FPS at medium settings, so you may as well play at 1440p. Dying Light is only officially supported on Intel Macs with AMD graphics cards. Thanks to the power of Rosetta 2 and the Metal framework, it performs incredibly well on this M2 Mac Mini. At 1080p high, it receives 70 to 120 FPS. Outstanding. We must remember though that this is quite an old AAA game and isn't that ambitious in the graphics department. I mean, it runs okay on Nintendo Switch. It also plays okay at 1440p high with 40 to 60 FPS. However, I think 60 FPS and over is ideal for this game, so I suggest staying at 1080p, or maybe try 1440p medium. Now for World of Warcraft. I don't like this game, so I'll keep this one short. At 1080p max graphics, it sees about 40 to 60 FPS. At 1080p high graphics, it now receives about 60 to 80 FPS, sometimes up to 100 on the odd occasion. If you want over 100 FPS, play at medium settings. I'm not the person to go to for when testing this game, but if I don't put it in this video, you all get really angry, so here it is. Unlike the original Life is Strange, the follow-up game is considerably more demanding. With Unreal Engine support, it has improved lip syncing, facial animations, and improved terrains to explore and see during cutscenes. At 1080p high, I found it goes anywhere from 45 to 60 FPS. If you want closer to 60 FPS, you'll need to play at 900p high. Or if you want to play at a higher resolution, try 1440p high, and you will receive 30 FPS. This is my favourite state to play this game in, as the frame rate is completely acceptable for this story adventure, and the visuals look really crisp. Everyone loves to see Minecraft. As most of you know by now, as of mid-2022, Minecraft is officially native on Apple Silicon. With popular mods installed through Fabric Loader, such as Sodium, Iris shaders, and FPS display, you can play at 1080p resolution, fancy settings with over 400 FPS. Amazing! Several shaders work too. I'm using the most common one, which is Silder's Vibrant Shaders version 1.50 high. This completely revamps the lighting and adds advanced effects like volumetric lighting, bloom, ambient occlusion, and reflections. You can play at 1080p fancy graphics with up to 60 FPS. Not bad in my eyes. I can easily play Dirt 4 on this Mac Mini at 1080p Ultra with 60 FPS. Feral recommends VSync for this one to remove the screen tearing, which can be quite noticeable. You can even play at 4K high with a locked 30 FPS. Just make sure to enable VSync to achieve this performance. I'm really looking forward to Grid Legends coming to Mac sometime in 2023 by Feral Interactive. Dirt 4 is the only modern AAA racer that we can play on Mac right now, and it's a 2017 title. I'm honestly a bit sick of it. Borderlands 3 is an infamous Mac port. Before Apple Silicon Macs, it was only playable on Intel Macs with an 8GB or better dedicated graphics card, and 16GB of memory. On my M2 Mac Mini at 1080p medium, it sees 37.50 FPS. This performance for an entry-level Mac is fantastic. The funny thing to consider though is that it sees very similar performance on, let's say, a 16-inch MacBook Pro with M2 Max. This is likely because it runs on the original Metal 1 framework. Sadly, the Metal Performance HUD doesn't work for Deus Ex Mankind Divided, so I have to use my external FPS capture tool, TR-Drop. Anyway, at 1080p high, it's receiving 32.5 FPS. It saw only 24 FPS on the M1 Mac Mini at high, so this is kind of cool. At 1080p medium, it sees 38.6 FPS. You may as well play it high because it sees similar performance. Deus Ex Mankind Divided is still a very demanding PC game, so overall, I think this performance is quite impressive considering the game is running on the original version of Metal 2.0. Disco Elysium was one of the first big games to support Apple Silicon natively. It runs freaking great on this M2 Mac Mini. For example, at 4K max graphics, it's getting about 45 to 60 FPS. Anti-aliasing has a massive impact on performance with this game, so I suggest disabling it if you want 60 FPS at 4K. I really hope the developer can port this game to M1 and M2 powered iPads in the future. I think it's possible. I've been playing CSGO since it released, but I'm not very good. So ignore the terrible gameplay against bots. Anyway, let's firstly have a look at what I believe is the most common resolution for pro players in CSGO. 960p at an aspect ratio of 4:3 and low settings. The FPS is around 150 to 300 plus FPS, an insanely high FPS, but I still imagine some pro players will laugh at this. Don't forget the game is running under the OpenGL API, which isn't officially supported on macOS anymore. At 1080p low, we're now seeing 100 to 250 FPS. This is another common resolution, so you can be happy knowing you can get by at this res. At 1080p high, we're seeing 100 to 200 FPS. At 1440p high, it drops down to 60 to 80 FPS. 4K isn't advised on this M2 Mac Mini, as you'll only receive about 40 to 50 FPS. CSGO requires 60 FPS to be borderline playable. In fact, the ideal FPS is probably 75 FPS or over if you plan to play competitively. Civ 6, here we go. At 1080p high, it sees 23.812 milliseconds in battle, or anywhere from 28 to 70 FPS, and a turn time of 11.17. At 1080p medium, it's now 15.008 milliseconds in battle, or anywhere from 50 to 110 FPS, with a turn time of 10.02. Here we have another 4x strategy game. I'm really not into these type of games, but if I don't include them, you'll make it known. Anyway, unlike Civ 6, this one is native, but its performance is quite worse, I think. I could not get the game to reach 60 FPS at 1080p, even in fast graphics quality. A little disappointing, but this one is a lot more optimized on higher end M2 and M1 chips. Not many know, but LoL now supports the Metal API in beta form instead of OpenGL. You must go into the game's files and add it in via the config file. I've left a link in the description on how to do this. Anyway, at 1080p, very high, we're seeing anywhere from 200 to 300 plus FPS. Pretty good, I think. Or at 4K, it's about 150 to 250 plus FPS. Again, I think that's pretty good, right? I don't really know what to do in this game though. What else can I say apart from the fact that NBA 2K23 Arcade Edition runs perfectly on this Mac Mini. In fact, it runs great on the original M1 Mac Mini, so I'm not surprised. We must remember the Arcade Edition of NBA runs on a modified version of the Echo Motion engine. This massively helps with its great performance. The game has a max resolution of 1080p, but you can play at ultra high with a locked 120 FPS. The game caps its FPS to your monitor's refresh rate, so if you have a 144Hz monitor, per se, I imagine it might even meet that. That's just pure speculation though. Prodeus is a first-person shooter of old, reimagined using modern rendering techniques and technology. Recently, it was updated for Apple Silicon-based Macs with native support. Strangely, this brought a little bug where you can't play above 60 FPS, based on my testing. Not a big issue, but it's worth noting. At 1080p max graphics, it sees about 58 to 60 FPS, which I think is pretty damn good. The game is also powered by the Unity engine, which is very well optimized for Apple Silicon. Myst might not be for everyone. It's a hardcore puzzle adventure game, and when I say hardcore, I mean hardcore. That being said, it's one of the best looking games on Mac, thanks to its photorealistic graphics powered by Unreal Engine 4 and HDR support. The best way to play this one is at 1080p with VSync enabled and a 60 FPS cap, then put AMD FSR to quality and you'll receive a mostly locked 60 FPS. It's one of the few modern, high-end games on this list that supports 4K on Apple Silicon. This is again thanks to AMD FSR being switched to balanced. Make sure to enable VSync again and an FPS cap of 30 for the best performance. It will drop into the mid-20s sometimes, but it's still worth it for the amazing photorealistic graphics on offer. Fun fact, Myst has also just been brought to iPhone and iPad and runs at epic graphics quality on the M1 and M2 iPad Pros. On Apple Silicon-based Macs, Sky Children of the Light is available through the App Store as an iPhone and iPad app. It's one of the best iOS games to try on M1 or M2 thanks to it supporting a 16:9 aspect ratio. Not only that, it receives a locked 60 FPS at 4K resolution. It's not a very demanding game, mind you, so this performance should not be a huge surprise. Sleeping Dogs Definitive Edition is one of the most underrated open world games out there, especially when it comes to Mac. I was so surprised when Feral Interactive ported it to Mac back in 2016. Anyway, it unfortunately runs on the OpenGL 4.1 and OpenCL frameworks, which are deprecated on macOS. This means I have to use my external FPS capture tool to measure the FPS. OpenGL means the game only receives 35.1 FPS at 1080p medium settings. It's the same performance that you'd see on pretty much any Apple Silicon based Mac. I really love this game, and I hope Feral can update it for Apple Silicon Macs in the future, but I strongly doubt they will. I also think it would fit very well on iPhone and iPad. Gloomhaven is a new tabletop strategy game ported to Mac in late 2021. Strangely, at 1080p, I found I could not get the FPS to improve at any graphics preset. It would always hover around 45 FPS, so I thought, I'll just leave it at fantastic quality. The game is powered by Unity, so I find it strange that the Apple Silicon port runs through Rosetta. Hopefully a native port is possible in the future and can allow for 60 FPS at 1080p. As most of you know, Black Ops 3 is the only COD we can play on Mac. Yes, I know, a little depressing. Also, online gameplay is broken in this game, but if you want to play offline against bots, you can do this by subscribing to the T7 weapons DLC and camos in the workshop. I've left a link to it in the description. Just note, there will be random big FPS stutters when you play offline against bots. The campaign is still fun though and doesn't have this issue. At 1080p high, it sees about 25 to 40 FPS. I don't suggest playing it high. If you want 60 FPS in campaign, play at 1080p medium with a render resolution of 90%. Similar to Dying Light, Black Ops 3 was only optimized for Intel Macs with an AMD graphics card. It's another good showcase of how these entry-level Macs are capable of playing fairly recent AAA games. Well-ish. I hope Aspire can fix online gameplay for this game, but I doubt they will. In early 2022, Giant Squid updated the Pathless for Apple Silicon. It's now native. On M1 or M2 Pro and M1 Max or M2 Max, the game supports 120 FPS at 1080p Ultra. It's just not the case on pure M1 or M2. For example, it receives around 25 to 30 FPS at 1080p high. Ouch. If you play at low settings, it will get 60 FPS. But low settings look disgusting in this game. Just like the iOS version, this optimization is not great here, and I hope it can improve. Despite Bioshock 2 being remastered in 2016, it's really not that much different to its original 2010 release. So the amazing performance here on M2 Mac Mini won't blow anyone away, I think. Still, Feral managed to optimize the original Intel Mac port much better than the Windows port. At 1440p max graphics, it's seeing anywhere from 80 to 200 FPS. Totally radical. It's also very playable at 4K max graphics with about 60 FPS. You can be happy knowing Bioshock 2 Remastered runs great on M2 Mac Mini. Somewhat recently, Unknown Worlds have added metal support to below zero, so it runs incredibly well on M2 Mac Mini. At 1080p high, I'm seeing about 50 to 60 FPS. Make sure to enable VSync for the best experience. In the past, it only received 30 FPS at 1080p medium on M1 Mac Mini. A big improvement. You can also play at 1440p high with about 25 to 30 FPS. Make sure to enable VSync to remove the screen tearing and big FPS spikes. Old but gold, Divinity Original Sin 2 is one of my favourite Mac RPGs. I'm running the game at 1080p Ultra, and it sees 60 FPS when exploring, but it will drop as low as 45 during combat. LVRLs recommend you enable VSync for this one for the best performance when aiming for a 60 FPS target. As I've said before, LVRLs don't really have a plan to update the Divinity Original Sin 2 port for the ARM64 architecture on Mac. It already runs fine. Pretty fine under Rosetta 2, so it would be a waste of their resources. Similar to Feral's Sleeping Dogs, Alien Isolation runs on deprecated frameworks, OpenGL 4.1 and OpenCL. This means its performance is mixed here. For example, at 1080p high, it sees only about 30 to 50 FPS. Feral told me they have no plans to update the Mac port. Note, enabling SSAO has massive performance issues on Apple Silicon. Make sure it's disabled. Disable it. Is it disabled? When Firewatch was first brought to Mac back in 2015, Campo Santo announced that it would support Metal on Mac in a future update. Unfortunately, the Metal update never came, and it still remains on OpenGL to this day. Again, just like all the other OpenGL games on this list, its performance is mixed on Apple Silicon or this M2 Mac Mini. It only receives 30 to 50 FPS at 1080p medium. Thankfully, this game doesn't require a hugely, massively high frame rate, so you can get by. Campo Santo haven't been very active online in the past few years, but I hope one day they can update the Firewatch Mac port in any way, as this is one of the best indie adventure games I've ever played. Farming Simulator 2022 might not be for everyone, I get that, but we must remember it's a very demanding PC game with impressive realistic graphics. It's also native here, unlike the previous games in this series. At 1080p medium, we're seeing anywhere from 40 to 60 FPS. In my eyes, not bad. Strangely, at 900p medium, it sees about the same performance, so just play at 1080p medium. Also, make sure to enable VSync with this one, which dramatically helps to remove the big FPS stutters with this one. It doesn't completely remove it, but it makes it a lot better, is what I'm trying to get at. Our last game to look at is the World War II strategy game Company of Heroes 2. Many forget that back in 2018, Feral Interactive made this game a 64-bit application and added metal support, so it performs kind of well on this M2 Mac Mini. At 1080p high, it receives 39.96 FPS. At 1080p medium, it's now up to 65.15 FPS. Awesome. Finally, at 900p high, it sees 50.73 FPS. This is a good option if you want high graphics with a higher FPS. Company of Heroes 3 is releasing soon on the 23rd of February, but it has not been confirmed if a Mac version is in the works. Here's hoping Feral Interactive are secretly working on a Mac port. So, what do you think of the gaming performance of the M2 Mac Mini? Are you impressed or disappointed? For me, it's acceptable performance. It's important to note, the M2 Mac Mini is kind of the cheapest entry point to Mac, starting at only $599 USD. This device here would be ideal for most of you who are just interested in gaming on Mac. It plays most games at 1080p and 30 FPS and above. It gets the job done. That's honestly quite awesome for a low-end Mac, or a machine with basically an integrated chip. The obvious downside is that there are hardly any new native games to play on Mac without some form of emulation. We do have some promising upcoming 2023 Mac releases, such as Grid Legends, The Medium, Everspace 2, Izonzo, and of course, No Man's Sky. In fact, I'm excited to report that 2 weeks ago, I was showcased a demo of No Man's Sky running on another base M2 Mac Mini at, wait for it, 4K resolution thanks to metal effects upscaling. Isn't that insane? Hopefully we can see more big AAA games in the not too distant future on Apple Silicon based Macs. Anyway, leave a like if you found this video helpful, and subscribe and turn on notifications to stay up to date with everything Apple gaming related. My name's Stewie, and thanks for watching.